I never imagined that a simple dinner invitation would become a memory I would replay in my mind for years. Even now, when the city quiets down and the lights outside my window blur into soft reflections, I think about that night and how ordinary it felt at the beginning. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, just a moment where loneliness spoke louder than reason. At that time, my life looked stable from the outside. I was in a relationship that had lasted long enough to lose its urgency. We shared routines, not conversations. Mornings were polite, evenings predictable, and silence had become something we both accepted without questioning. There was no betrayal yet, not even the thought of it. But there was distance, and distance has a way of creating empty spaces where dangerous thoughts can grow. That night, I decided to walk instead of taking a ride home. The air was warm, and the streets were alive with muted sounds, cars passing, distant laughter, music leaking from small restaurants. I told myself I needed the walk to clear my head. I had spent the entire day feeling unseen, like my presence existed only as a habit in someone else's life. I didn't know I was searching for anything. I only knew I didn't want to go home yet. That was when I noticed them. Two black African men standing near the entrance of a small restaurant, talking quietly between themselves. They looked relaxed, confident in a way that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. When our eyes met, one of them smiled, not the kind that feels intrusive, but warm, almost familiar. I slowed without realizing it. They greeted me politely, asking if I was from around there. The conversation was brief at first, harmless, filled with small talk about the neighborhood and the food inside the restaurant. Their voices were calm, their manner respectful. There was no pressure, no suggestion of anything improper. It felt safe, and that sense of safety lowered my guard more than any charm ever could. Then came the invitation. One of them mentioned they were about to have dinner and asked if I would like to join them. He said it casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I laughed at first, surprised, instinctively ready to decline. I thought about my partner, about how strange it would sound even in my own mind. But I also thought about the quiet apartment waiting for me, about another night of eating alone while sitting beside someone who felt miles away. I hesitated, and they noticed. The other man spoke then, gently, saying there was no obligation, no expectation. Just dinner, he said. Good food and conversation. Those words stayed with me. Just dinner. I repeated them silently, using them as a shield against the unease rising in my chest. As we talked a little longer, I felt something unfamiliar but comforting, attention. They listened when I spoke, really listened, not glancing away or rushing to fill the silence. They asked questions that showed curiosity rather than habit. I caught myself smiling more than I had in weeks, and that realization unsettled me. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People are allowed to talk. People are allowed to eat together. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, my phone felt heavy in my bag. I knew there would be messages waiting, routine check-ins, nothing urgent. I didn't look. I didn't want anything to interrupt the moment, and that was the first choice I made that night that truly mattered. Avoiding a screen seemed insignificant, but deep down I knew I was already creating a small secret. When I finally agreed to join them, it felt less like a decision and more like giving into a quiet pull. We walked inside together, the door closing behind us with a soft sound that echoed louder in my thoughts than it should have. As we sat down and menus were placed in front of us, I felt a strange mix of excitement and guilt, neither fully formed yet. I remember thinking, as the waiter poured water into our glasses, that this was still harmless. I was still the same person. I was still loyal, but somewhere between that thought and my first laugh at something one of them said, a line began to blur. I didn't see it clearly then. I only felt a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time, and for that moment, it was enough to keep me seated at that table, believing I was still in control. The restaurant felt different once we settled in, as if the outside world had quietly slipped away. The lighting was low and forgiving, casting soft shadows across the walls, and a slow rhythm played somewhere in the background, steady and unhurried. I noticed how easily the noise of my thoughts softened there, replaced by the gentle clatter of plates and the murmur of other conversations that didn't concern me. For the first time in days, I felt present. They asked what I liked to eat, and when I hesitated, unsure, one of them smiled and recommended a dish he said reminded him of home. There was pride in his voice, not arrogance, just a quiet confidence shaped by memory. As the waiter left, the three of us began to talk more freely, the kind of conversation that unfolds without effort. It surprised me how natural it felt, as though we were continuing a discussion that had already begun long ago. They spoke about their lives, about traveling and adapting, about what it meant to be far from familiar places. I listened, genuinely interested, and found myself sharing more than I usually did with strangers. I talked about my work, about how busy my days were and how empty my evenings had become. I didn't frame it as dissatisfaction, but the truth slipped through anyway, woven into the pauses between my words. What struck me most was the way they listened. There was no impatience, no half attention. One of them leaned back slightly, watching me with a thoughtful expression, while the other nodded at the right moments, asking questions that made me reflect instead of defend myself. I realized how long it had been since anyone had asked me how I was really doing and waited for an honest answer. When the food arrived, the table filled with rich scents that made the moment feel indulgent, almost intimate. We shared dishes, passing plates, laughing when someone reached for the same thing at the same time. The ease of it all unsettled me. I was aware, constantly, of the invisible boundary I was approaching, and yet I let myself enjoy the warmth of their attention. I told myself that enjoying conversation was not betrayal. At some point, one of them asked about my relationship. The question wasn't invasive, it felt natural, inevitable. I paused longer than necessary before answering, choosing my words carefully. I said I was with someone, that things were fine, just quiet. Saying it out loud made the silence I lived with sound heavier than I intended. Neither of them judged me. One simply said that quiet can be peaceful, but it can also be lonely. The honesty of that statement lingered between us. I felt seen in a way that startled me. It wasn't flirtation in the obvious sense, but there was a subtle closeness growing, built from shared understanding rather than touch. I noticed how I stopped mentioning my partner altogether as the evening went on. Not intentionally, but as if my mind had decided to place that part of my life gently to the side so it wouldn't disrupt the mood. My phone buzzed once in my bag. I knew without looking who it was. The vibration felt like a distant knock on a door I wasn't ready to open. I ignored it, then felt a sharp flicker of guilt, followed by an equally sharp wave of justification. I deserved one peaceful evening, I told myself. One night where I didn't feel like an afterthought. Time moved differently there. Glasses were refilled, laughter came easier, and the space between us seemed to shrink without anyone consciously closing it. When one of them reached across the table to move a dish closer to me, his hand brushed mine for just a second. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet my heart reacted as if it meant more. I pulled my hand back slowly, hoping no one noticed how much that small moment affected me. As the dinner wound down, I realized how late it had become. The restaurant had grown quieter, chairs turned upside down on empty tables around us. Part of me felt relief that the night was ending, that I would soon return to the familiar safety of my routine. Another part resisted the thought, clinging to the fragile bubble we had created together. When we stepped outside, the air felt cooler, sharper against my skin. We stood there for a moment, none of us in a hurry to leave. One of them asked, softly, if I wanted to continue the evening somewhere quieter. He didn't move closer. He didn't touch me. He simply waited. In that pause, I felt the full weight of the choice in front of me. Going home would mean returning to silence, to questions unasked and answers assumed. Staying would mean stepping further into something I couldn't pretend was innocent anymore. I looked at their faces, open and patient, and then down at the street glowing under the lights. I don't know, I said honestly. But even as the words left my mouth, I sensed that my hesitation was no longer about whether I wanted to go. It was about whether I was brave enough to admit that part of me already had. The silence after my words felt heavier than any answer I could have given. None of us spoke for a moment, and in that pause, I became painfully aware of my own breathing, of the way my heart had begun to race as if it already knew what I was about to do. I told myself that hesitation was a sign of responsibility, that the fact I was thinking at all meant I hadn't crossed the line yet. But lines don't always announce themselves clearly. Sometimes they fade under your feet before you realize you've stepped beyond them. We started walking, slowly at first, as if no one wanted to be the one to decide the direction. The street was quieter now, the city winding down, storefront lights dimmed or turned off entirely. Our footsteps echoed softly against the pavement, and I felt suspended between two versions of myself, the one who belonged to a life I had built, and the one who was suddenly curious about who she could be if she stopped holding herself back. They didn't pressure me. That, more than anything, made it harder to turn away. One of them spoke about something trivial, a memory from a different city, his voice steady and unassuming. The normality of the conversation made what we were doing feel almost reasonable. Almost. I nodded, laughed at the right moments, all while a quiet voice in my head reminded me that I could still stop, still say goodbye and go home alone. We reached a building and paused again. The entrance was modest, nothing dramatic, just another doorway among many. I knew what standing there meant, even if no one said it aloud. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. I didn't take it out. I already knew what it would say, and I wasn't ready to face the simplicity of that other world where choices were clearer and consequences delayed. Inside, the space was calm and uncluttered. Soft light filled the room, and the city's noise faded into a distant hum. I sat down, my movements careful, deliberate, as if moving slowly might give me time to reconsider. We talked again, but the conversation had shifted. There was an awareness between us now, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were no longer pretending this was just an extension of dinner. When one of them sat beside me, close enough that I could feel his warmth, my body reacted before my mind could intervene. I told myself I was allowed to feel something. Feeling wasn't the same as doing. But when his hand rested near mine, not touching, just close enough to be noticed, I felt the last of my resolve weaken. I didn't pull away. I didn't move closer either. I simply stayed still, and in that stillness, consent quietly took shape. What followed wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was slow, almost careful, as if everyone involved understood the fragility of the moment. I won't pretend I didn't know what I was doing. I did. Every step forward was a choice, and with each one, the image of my partner flickered briefly in my mind before being pushed aside by a stronger desire to feel wanted, present, alive. The line I had been so cautious around earlier was no longer visible at all. Afterward, the room felt different. The warmth lingered, but so did something heavier, something that pressed against my chest and made it harder to breathe deeply. I sat quietly, wrapped in my own thoughts, listening to the faint sounds outside. No one spoke for a while, and I was grateful for that. Words would have made it too real, too impossible to compartmentalize. Eventually, I stood and said I needed to go. The decision came suddenly, driven by a wave of clarity that cut through the haze. They didn't try to stop me. One of them walked me to the door, his expression gentle, unreadable. There was no promise of seeing each other again, no attempt to define what had happened. In some ways, that made it worse. There was nothing to frame the experience as a mistake or a future possibility. It simply existed. The walk home felt longer than usual. The streets were nearly empty now, and the city lights seemed harsher, less forgiving. I took my phone out at last. There were messages waiting, exactly as I had expected. Simple words, routine concern, the kind of communication I had dismissed earlier as insufficient. My chest tightened as I read them, guilt spreading through me with an intensity I hadn't anticipated. When I reached my door, I hesitated again, hand resting on the handle. Inside was the life I had momentarily stepped away from, unchanged and unaware. I wondered if I would be able to slip back into it without leaving traces of where I had been. As I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I knew one thing with unsettling certainty: even if no one else ever knew what I had done, I would carry the weight of that night with me. And it would change everything that followed. Home felt unfamiliar the moment I stepped inside, as if the walls themselves could sense what I was carrying. Everything was exactly where I had left it: the dim lamp in the corner, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the quiet order of a life built on routine. My partner was there, half asleep on the couch, the television casting soft light across his face. He looked up when he heard the door and smiled, the kind of tired, trusting smile that made my chest ache. "Did you have a good night?" he asked. The question was simple, almost careless, and it caught me off guard. I nodded, managing a vague answer that felt hollow even as it left my mouth. I sat beside him, close enough to feel the familiar comfort of his presence, yet painfully aware of the distance I had created. He didn't notice anything different, or if he did, he didn't mention it. That, somehow, made it worse. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken tension. I moved through my routines as usual, but everything felt slightly out of place, like a picture hanging just crooked enough to draw my eye again and again. I laughed when appropriate, responded when spoken to, and played my role convincingly. Still, there was a constant noise in my head, a reminder of what I had done and what it meant about me. At night, sleep came in fragments. When I closed my eyes, memories of the dinner and the moments that followed surfaced without warning. Not as something purely pleasurable, but as something complicated and unsettling. Alongside them came the image of my partner, unaware and trusting, and the contrast made my stomach twist. I realized then that the excitement I had felt was already fading, replaced by a quiet, persistent regret. I tried to convince myself that I could move on, that one mistake didn't have to define an entire relationship. But guilt has a way of reshaping even the smallest interactions. A casual touch felt loaded with meaning. Ordinary conversations felt dishonest. The more I tried to bury the truth, the heavier it became, until it colored everything we shared. He began to notice the change. It showed in the way he watched me a little longer than usual, in the pauses before he spoke. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the table, he asked if something was wrong. His voice was calm, concerned, and completely free of accusation. That was the moment I understood that silence was no longer protecting either of us. I told him the truth, haltingly, without unnecessary detail. I spoke about the dinner, about how lonely I had felt, about how I had made choices I couldn't take back. I didn't justify what I had done, but I also didn't pretend it came from nowhere. As the words left my mouth, I felt both lighter and terrified, as if I had stepped into open air without knowing whether I would land. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, the quiet that followed was different from any silence we had shared before. It was raw and final. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the slow realization settling in. He didn't raise his voice or demand explanations. He simply nodded, as if accepting something deeply painful that he could not change. The aftermath was not dramatic. There were no slammed doors or shouted arguments. Instead, there was a slow unraveling. Trust, once broken, didn't shatter all at once, it eroded. Conversations became careful. Affection became hesitant. We tried, for a while, to find our way back to what we had been, but the ease we once shared never fully returned. Eventually, we acknowledged what had become impossible to ignore. Something fundamental had shifted, and neither of us knew how to repair it. Ending the relationship felt like admitting failure, but staying felt like prolonging a quiet kind of pain. When we finally decided to part ways, it was with sadness rather than anger, and that made the loss feel even heavier. In the weeks that followed, I spent a lot of time alone, replaying everything in my mind. I thought about the two men, about the attention and warmth that had drawn me in so quickly. I realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that the night hadn't been about them at all. It had been about my own unspoken needs, about choosing escape over honesty. Infidelity, I learned, doesn't begin with physical closeness. It begins much earlier, in the moments when loneliness is ignored and silence is accepted as normal. I didn't lose my relationship that night because of a single decision. I lost it when I stopped speaking up, when I allowed distance to grow without confronting it. Now, when I think back to that dinner, I don't see it as a thrilling mistake or a defining passion. I see it as a mirror, reflecting parts of myself I hadn't wanted to face. And while I can't undo what happened, I carry the lesson with me. Love requires attention, honesty, and the courage to protect it, long before temptation ever has a chance to appear.